get all the time, Stacy, why is my knitting curling? And usually the question is asked to me this way: Stacy, I'm a beginning knitter. I've decided to knit a totally simple scarf, totally simple stockinette scarf, and it's curling up, and will blocking help? And I see this question so much, and it's because people, especially beginning knitters, think scarf is very simple, stockinette is very simple, it's a match made in heaven. But it's not, because stockinette curls up. And really any stitch combination you're using for a flat piece of knitting that is what I would call stockinette based, where there are more stitches there are more knit stitches on one side and more purl stitches on the other, that piece is probably not going to lie flat. So in this video, we're going to talk about your knitting curling up, and when it's good and when it's bad, and how to avoid it, etc. To answer the first question, which is, will blocking help my stockinette scarf that's curling? Yeah, for 5 minutes it will help. You can wash it and set it out flat to dry, and it'll look pretty good, and you'll pick it up and you'll put it on your neck, and you can watch your watch, because in 3 minutes it'll be curling again. Stockinette stitch curls. The way you can avoid it a little bit is to use, to knit in a really big gauge where you're using a big needle size and smaller yarn. Tighter gauge will curl more, looser gauge will curl less, but it'll still curl. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the curling that I'm talking about and how to avoid it or how to love it. Here we go. Here is a sample in straight stockinette, and this is actually a gauge swatch. People ask me all the time, what do you do with those swatches? Well, I go into the bin and pull out little things so I can demonstrate in videos like this. So this has been blocked, but it's curling on the side because it's straight stockinette. It's curling more on one side than the other, but it is curling on both sides, and that's just what stockinette does. And here is a stitch that I would call stockinette based. This is a fancy stitch combo called Sugar Cubes. And because it's mostly knit on one side and mostly purl on the other, it's going to curl. And this has been totally blocked, and as soon as I unpinned it from the blocking board, it did this. And it's not bad for showing, for demonstrating the stitch, but if this was my scarf, that would drive me nuts. So that's when it's bad. Here's an example of when it's good. This is funny. I made this hat years and years ago, and it's one of my favorite hats because it's alpaca, which means it's really warm, and it's loose. It doesn't mess up my hair. But there's no brim on this hat, you see? Well, there's no brim knit in because the brim is just this curling stockinette stitch. That's what it does. That's the brim of the hat, is the curl on the edge. So that's when it's good. That's when you like it and you have this brim. You have the curl of the stitch is actually worked into the pattern. And I, of course, will give you a link to this alpaca hat pattern that I love so much. And here are some ways of getting around the curling on stockinette. If you watch my video called Stellar Swatching, this is how I knit stockinette swatches so that they don't curl. And it's not really that big of a deal. I can still measure stitches per inch if it was curling, but this is such a nicer experience. If you knit a garter stitch border or any border around a stockinette, it will keep it from curling. It will always lie flat. And here's one sample, and here's my favorite swatch. This is the swatch from my Rodeo Drive Poncho, a cashmere swatch. It feels nice, but the garter stitch border keeps it from curling. And here is another example I'm going to pull up from my lap. This is a stockinette sweater, and the reason that it doesn't curl, because it would be curling a lot here at the button band. The reason it doesn't is because we have a button band. There are no buttons on it, but it's still called a button band. This is knit on it to keep it from curling, and then up here the ribbing on the collar keeps it from curling, and we have the same border at the bottom of ribbing that keeps it from curling. So you end up with a sweater that's stockinette like this, but it's not curling because all of the edges are carefully covered in ribbing that will help it lie flat. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of stitches that don't curl. Here I have seed stitch, which is knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, and then you purl the knits and knit the purls on the wrong side row. It gives you this bumpy fabric, and because it's half knits, half purls on each side and not predominantly one or the other, this lies flat, and it's a pretty stitch. You can make a whole scarf out of this and it would not curl. And here's another example. This is just garter stitch, which when you're knitting a flat piece is knitting every row. And because it's knit every row on both sides, there are equal number of knits and purls or knits on each side, and it does not curl. Totally flat. This has, this is an old swatch, so if it was blocked, it was years ago. I think I might have used this in my log cabin blanket tutorial, and it still has not curled. And here's an example of a stitch that is just enough knits and purls alternating to keep it from curling. This is this side has more. The wrong side actually has more knits on it. So you would think there would be more curling than this, but there are just enough knits and purls alternated in this basket weave stitch. And this is a sample from my Mimi hooded scarf pattern. Just enough to keep it from curling and to keep it flat. And one last thing I don't want to forget to say to all of the people who ask me, will my stockinette scarf block out? And I have to say no. This is what I always tell them. I always say your best bet, especially if you're a beginning knitter, your best bet is to use a tried and true scarf pattern that someone has designed in a stitch combination that won't curl. And the stitch, the pattern that I always recommend is called One Row Hand Spun Scarf. I think that's the name of it. You don't have to use hand spun yarn. The pattern is by Stephanie Pearl McPhee, who's also known as the Yarn Harlot. And I will give you a link to this scarf in the video description field below. And it's a great pattern because it is the same stitch, both sides are the same pattern stitch repeat. And it's not masculine or feminine. It looks good on everyone. You can use any yarn, any gauge, and it turns out to be a nice scarf. Anyway, all the links to everything you see here, as well as that scarf, will be in the video description field below, as well as on my website. I hope I helped answer the question about why your knitting is curling. Good luck.